On May 25th, 2020, when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes in full view of video cameras, many Americans asked, how could this have happened? And many of us vowed to never let it happen again. I'm Brian Brown, and this is my video series on structural racism in the United States for the East Hampton Public Schools. Racism is our problem to fix, and if we're going to fight against it, we have to understand it. Today's lesson is about assassinations. We've been telling a pretty long and complicated story so far, but really there's a simplicity to it as well. Let's face it, there was slavery for hundreds of years. Powerful white people in the South directly benefited their comfort, their wealth, their power derived from the fact that human beings were being kept in a subservient level to them, that black people were. All right? With the end of slavery, anytime that black people had an opportunity to advance, to rise up from their current situation, powerful people, powerful white people came up with a way to keep them from really advancing, to keep them down. That's the story we've been hearing. Okay, so we've just been talking about the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement was, a multi-pronged attack on structural racism, using the courts, using direct action, all right, appealing to politicians in Congress, the president, running for political office, all sorts of things like that. And we've learned about ways that barriers, roadblocks have been thrown up to that equal participation in society that African Americans are supposed to be able to do as equal citizens. Well, today we're going to talk about assassinations. Sometimes there were leaders who were too big of a threat. They were too powerful, too charismatic, too capable of uniting large groups of people. And as a result, people decided to murder them. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. There are 4 different leaders. A couple of them you've heard of. All of them I think you'll be hearing more about in the coming months and years. So we're going to start with Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers, not necessarily a household name. He was an NAACP field officer from Jackson, Mississippi. He was very, very involved in the Civil Rights Movement, as was his wife, Myrlie Evers. Anyway, Medgar Evers was involved very heavily in the desegregation of the University of Mississippi. All right, so Ole Miss used to not accept black people, whites only, and they were completely segregated. And Medgar Evers was a big part of the movement to get that changed. Some of you may have heard of James Meredith. Medgar Evers was also involved not only in the desegregation of Ole Miss, but also in James Meredith's admission to that college, so James Meredith was a black man. He was admitted to Ole Miss once it was desegregated. And in 1962, when he was going to go to college, he decided that he was going to make a march out of it. And so he began the March Against Fear. So in 1962, James Meredith marches from Memphis, Tennessee, and he's going to march to Jackson, Mississippi. And he's going to march by himself, and it's a march against fear. He wants to show people that he's not afraid. Now, he knows people are really angry in Mississippi. White people are really angry that the school has been integrated and black people are going to be able to go there now. Okay? But he's showing that he's not afraid. On the second day of his march, he is shot. And luckily he's not killed. But he's shot, he's brought to the hospital, and and he's treated. And he finished the march. Once he recovered, he finished the march, and this time he wasn't alone. And when he finished the march, he marched with 15,000 other people accompanying him to show that they were supporting James Meredith going to the previously segregated University of Mississippi. So Medgar Evers was instrumental in the desegregation of the university, but also in James Meredith's movement, and so on and so forth. Medgar Evers also was very involved in trying to get public hearings and so on and so forth about the murder of Emmett Till. So we talked about Emmett Till in an earlier episode. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was lynched in Money, Mississippi, and you may remember he was murdered and submerged in a river, and his mom gave an open casket funeral. He was from Chicago. In this big cathedral in Chicago, there was a full, like, 2-page spread, close-up picture of his face in the open casket. It was a big deal. Anyway, the guys who murdered him, after they were found not guilty by a jury, they confessed that they did it to a journalist. We have a thing called double jeopardy in the country. Once you've been accused and tried of a crime, if you're found not guilty, they can't try you again. The woman whose evidence it was used in the trial, she said that he grabbed her. Certainly not a reason to murder somebody, but that was fabricated. She admitted to that later. Anyway, Medgar Evers was trying to get a public coverage of that case to try to expose what had happened. Anyway, so in 1963, in June of 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated. So Medgar Evers was already seen as a pretty serious threat. He was followed regularly by the police in Jackson. He was also followed by the FBI. And so from what people tend to say, there were usually at least 2 cars following Medgar Evers everywhere he went. Was it for his protection, or was it so that they could, sort of spy on what he's doing? A little bit more on the FBI and sort of what they had going on during the Civil Rights Movement soon. We'll talk about that really soon. But anyway, on that day, June 12th, 1963, neither the police nor the FBI followed him home. He parked the car in the driveway, got out, and was shot several times right in his driveway by a guy by the name of Byron De La Beckwith. And he didn't die immediately. His wife, Merle, came out, saw him. They got him in a car. They brought him to the nearest hospital. The nearest hospital was whites only, and they weren't going to admit him. And then they're like, well, this is Medgar Evers. And they were like, okay, I guess we'll take him. They admit him, but he dies. De La Beckwith, by the way, was put on trial twice for the assassination, for the murder. And both times there was a hung jury. The jury couldn't decide whether he was guilty or not. Merle Evers never gave up, though, and she continued to sort of press, and she was able to come up with some new evidence that hadn't been seen before, and eventually he was convicted and sentenced to long enough so that he died in prison. But he wasn't. So this happened in '63. He was finally convicted in '94. He went to prison then. So that's a long time for him to be free. By the way, this is how you spell Merle Evers. I keep saying her name, but I made a card. Might as well show you. Okay, so that's the first person. Second person I want to talk about, many of you have certainly heard of him, and that's Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. He found himself in prison. While he was in prison, he met members of a group called the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is an American organization. They are not affiliated with other types of Islam, but certainly Islam inspired. It was led by a guy by the name of Elijah Muhammad. And the X, just to explain it, the idea is that people in the Nation of Islam, they drop their last name because the idea is if you're an African American, the last name that you have may very well have come from the family who owned you. All right, so if he was Malcolm Little, then probably his family way back was owned by the Little family. And that's not the kind of thing you want to carry around with you as your last name, having the last name of people who thought that you were property, that you were livestock. Okay, and so the X being like the variable in mathematics, basically saying like I'm Malcolm, nobody knows what my last name is because my history has been erased, my past, my heritage, even what part of Africa my ancestors come from, all of that is gone. All right, I don't even know what my last name is. So that's what Malcolm X comes from. Anyway, by the way, if I couldn't more highly recommend the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. All right, so Alex Haley, not so ghosty, ghost wrote Malcolm X's autobiography, but it is an incredible book. Alex Haley, by the way, the author who wrote Roots, which is also an incredible read, and actually a pretty good miniseries as well. If you don't feel like reading a book, but you want to watch, I don't know, Ben Vereen and a young Geordie LaForge / Reading Rainbow guy. Anyway, so the Nation of Islam is the organization that Malcolm X was originally for. So the Nation of Islam is a pretty interesting organization, but it is very much a pro-black separation from white society. And so actually the Nation of Islam was kind of okay with a lot of segregationists and stuff like that. Now, we haven't really talked about the North yet. All right, we've been focusing a lot on the South. And I've told you before, I don't intend to pull any punches on the North. That we up in the North tend to be, we sort of pat ourselves on the back like we didn't have racism here, or we don't have racism here compared to the South, and it's just different racism. But anyway, so Nation of Islam is an organization, and there's Malcolm himself goes through a lot of positive change with it. So people don't drink and things like that. When you see Nation of Islam families and stuff like that, people dress really well. I mean, there's a lot of appeal to the organization because it's about self-determination. It's about treating your body, yourself, your mind really well, etc., etc. Anyway, the Nation of Islam was led by a guy by the name of Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X is an incredible speaker, and all of a sudden he becomes the face of the Nation of Islam, and he writes these incredible speeches, and he gives them, and he's never trying to gain benefit for himself. He's always speaking for the Nation of Islam. He's always speaking for Elijah Muhammad. Now, the organization was pretty intense, and they really pulled very few punches about how they felt about racism and white people, and calling white people devils, and so on and so forth. It's pretty inflammatory language, no question about it. Anyway, Malcolm X gets himself in some trouble with some of the things he says in 1963. With the Kennedy assassination and things like that. Elijah Muhammad censors him. He says you can't speak publicly for a while. And it's very clear that there's some tension between these two guys, that Elijah Muhammad is maybe feeling threatened by how successful and powerful, how people are thinking when they think Nation of Islam. They're not thinking Elijah Muhammad anymore, they're thinking Malcolm X. And Malcolm X learned some stuff about Elijah Muhammad that he thinks isn't very honest, or in keeping with his own teachings and stuff like that. They have a falling out. Anyway, so one of the 5 pillars of Islam, if it's something that you might have learned about in school, but one of the main things that Muslims are supposed to do, if they can, is that they're supposed to visit Mecca. So Mecca is the holy city where Islam is founded. There's a building called the Kaaba and a mosque around it. A mosque is a place where Muslims pray, like a church but different. Anyway, you're supposed to go, if you can, any Muslim who can is supposed to go visit Mecca. It's a holy pilgrimage, and it's called the Hajj, H-A-J. So Malcolm X, while he's kind of like cooling off with Elijah Muhammad anyway, he decides he's going to go on the Hajj. And this is a huge transformative period for Malcolm X because while he's, when he's been in the Nation of Islam, it's been very much like, white people are evil and bad, and black people are good, and so on and so forth. Anyway, he goes on the Hajj, and he's meeting people from all over the world who are Muslims, like he is. And he's praying with them, and he's eating with them, and and he realizes like that his focus has been too narrow, and so Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam, and he wants to focus on the idea of a broader umbrella, bringing more people together. All right, Malcolm X used to have some pretty nasty things to say about Martin Luther King Jr., for example. All right, and people tend to focus when you have like 2 civil rights leaders who have like a different approach. They tend to really focus on their differences, right? When you learn about W.E.B. Du Bois, you often learn that Booker T. Washington and him didn't see eye to eye, that they hated each other because Booker T. Washington was about like black people getting vocational training, learning a trade and stuff like that. And okay, if the world's going to be racist, at least you can get a trade and make yourself some money. Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois is like, well, to hell with racism, like forget it. We're gonna try to send the most talented black people to universities and stuff like that, and we're going to change things that way. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that in history we tend to look at these differences between people and we really focus on it. Like those 2 guys hated each other. The reality is that those 2 guys agreed on almost everything. All right, that black people were being treated horribly in America, and white people had set up a racist structure in society that was holding them back. All right, they had different approaches to how they could fix that, but they weren't like, oh, that's that guy's dumb, only do my approach. They anyway. How do I know that? I studied with David Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois' son at UMass. He told me. I feel like that's a pretty good source. If W.E.B. Du Bois' son told me that W.E.B. didn't have major beef with Booker T, I'm going to believe him on that. All right, and it's the same thing with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Sure, and you can go through, you can find some nasty stuff that was said back and forth. All right, but the point is that these guys wanted to end racism. They were operating in very different worlds. All right, Martin Luther King tried to go up to North. And it was not successful. When he went to Chicago, it was very, very hard for him. Malcolm X didn't spend a lot of time in the South, but like the idea is that they were from kind of different worlds. And eventually they got on pretty good terms. They only met once, I believe. There's a couple photographs of them. But anyway, so when Malcolm X came back from the Hajj in Mecca, he formed the Organization for Afro-American Unity. This is a Pan-African organization. I don't want to branch out too much. Pan-Africanism is this idea that Africans in Africa, there's a lot of countries in Africa, and then Africans in the diaspora, so people who live outside of Africa, try to help each other out. Try to sort of unify and do things that elevate, all Africans. So that was his organization. By the way, when you go on Hajj, you get to add a title to your name, which is Al-Hajj. So Malcolm X actually changed his name, and he picked a name that he thought sort of fit better with being now a Sunni Muslim. The Sunni Islam is the most common form of Islam in the world, and that's the type of Islam. So he left Nation of Islam, became a Sunni Muslim. He changed his name to El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And the Shabazz name is actually a pretty common name to see these days in reference to Malcolm X. Anyway, so Malcolm X goes from being sort of this firebrand, this civil rights by any means necessary, use violence if you got to, kind of approach. Very, very easy to sort of for people to target and say, this is a dangerous guy, we don't want this guy around, all right? He says white people are devils and you know, shouldn't be trusted. Very, very easy for white people to say, you know, to discount Malcolm X, to say, hey, look, there's, you know, there are these dangerous people out here who wanna kill you. Like, let's just keep these structures of racism in place, or else this guy's gonna come kill you. All right, but Malcolm X goes through this change, and all of a sudden he's talking about working with the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, right? Not only across, you know, political ideology, but across religion and so on and so forth. And that becomes too much. He becomes too big of a threat. In 1965, Malcolm X is in the Audubon Ballroom. He's about to give a speech. And he is rushed by three guys, a guy with a shotgun and two guys with semi-automatic rifles, and they shoot him in front of 400 people. The crowd actually, you know, kind of converges on these guys who shoot him. Two of the guys get away, one of the guy doesn't. Anyway, you know, they put the guys on trial. These guys have connections with the Nation of Islam, right? And so there's this theory that the Nation of Islam or Elijah Muhammad put the hit on Malcolm X. But there are also some interesting connections to things like the FBI and law enforcement as well. Now, I was going to talk about this more with Martin Luther King, but or with Fred Hampton. But there was a program called COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Program. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, really started this organization, or this program within the FBI, and they were looking to infiltrate, to surveil, and to discredit or somehow bring down a bunch of political organizations, not just civil rights organizations, the anti-war movement, organizations like the Nation of Islam, or, you know, Malcolm X's later incarnations. They harassed the heck out of Martin Luther King. There's a lot of evidence that you can find on that. But they went after the AIM movement, American Indian movement, and stuff like that, Young Lords and other Puerto Rican independence movements, and so on and so forth. So anyway, the guy who we know shot Malcolm X, when they arrested two other guys and said these are the guys who did it, he, to his sort of deathbed, said those weren't the two guys that were there. But anyway, so Malcolm X murdered in 1965, Audubon Ballroom in New York.